It's a beautiful morning for a trip on the Grand River. I'm Poppins.
I'm Chuck.
The channel's Restless Viking. Join us for our adventure.
This is the longest river on the Great Lakes, 252 miles long, and it was important to anyone that lived anywhere near it. This is Loki, our freighter canoe. We're taking a trip from the rapids to the haven on the Grand.
We're here at the Boynton Landing along the Grand River, and this area has been owned by the Boynton family for over 150 years.
They own an airport, a campground, and then the Grand Lady is a riverboat.
Captain Bill Boynton and his son Greg own the Grand Lady riverboat.
And you can see that gangway that drops down when they reach a landing area on the Grand River. It drops down so the passengers can get off and the freight can get off. And this is really interesting. They pull the Grand Lady up sideways from the river during the winter, and then they launch it back this way in the summertime, which I think is pretty cool. This family does a lot of cool stuff here on the Grand River.
The Grand Lady runs during the summer from May 1st to October 31st, I believe. Check their website, it's a fun ride. So Captain Bill Boynton says that people could just flag down steamships by waving.
So the Grand River got its start about 12,000 years ago when the Wisconsin ice sheet started melting and retreating. All that water had to go somewhere, so right around the Grand River Valley area, it flowed south at first, and then it flowed southwest, and then eventually, today, it flows kind of northwest into the large glacial lake, which was Lake Chicago, and today is Lake Michigan. So that large glacial drainage ditch is today the Grand River. A few years after the ice retreated, the trees came in, and so did North American tribes, because the Grand River provided food and transportation. But there was another thing along the banks of the Grand River, and it was furry animals. Lots and lots of furry animals like beaver, muskrat, and those animals provided some very valuable pelts to the people in Europe. So when Fort Mackinac sprouted up, this area was under its supervision, and the LaFramboise family came down to start fur trading in the Grand River Valley.
Hey Chuck, do you feel like a lap of luxury sitting on my double cushions up there?
And then she has a few pads sitting here, 2 of them. It's like the lap of luxury. So Madame LaFramboise is probably one of my favorite stories from the Grand River. Her husband was killed, she heads down to the trading post, and she was part Odawa, and I believe part French. And she took over his business, and because of her relationship with the other natives in the area, she made a crap load of money and became one of the most successful fur traders in North America. And she retired at the ripe old age of 41, and she still did some great things. She started a school for the native children on Mackinac Island, and she's from our hometown, Lowell, Michigan. So when they were trapping those fur-bearing animals on this river, they were transporting them up and down the river in canoes about this size and a little bit bigger. But eventually, they trapped what they needed to, and by the 1850s or so, the settlers started coming. And where we started, just a couple miles upriver, used to be the rapids, hence the name Grand Rapids. Those rapids were a mile long and about 300 feet wide. Eventually, as the river dried up in the summers, eventually they dammed the river to keep it from drying up so much and keeping water there all the time, and that tamed the rapids. So steamboats used to run upriver from the rapids and also downriver. Right now, we're going at the speed that a riverboat might have gone.
Steamboats carried passengers and freight along this river from 1837 to about 1858, when the Detroit, Grand Haven, and Milwaukee Railroad ran north of here, and that was a lot faster. The Governor Mason was the first steamboat on this river. It was built in 1837. They didn't have a whistle or any way, so they hired a bugler, and he was paid to stand on the bow and bugle the announcement that they were coming into port.
In the early 1960s, some state reps thought that Grand Rapids needed a 4-year college. So in 1963, they formed Grand Valley State College. Its first class was 224 students. Today, it's got about 24,000 students and is a university.
Right up there is Blendon Landing. It is one of about 24 landings along the Grand River. Now, the interesting thing is these settlements popped up all around this place. Here at Blendon Landing, they had sawmill, they had a lumber company, a blacksmith shop, a school, a boarding house, and they were all painted red. The lumber company produced masks out of pine lumber, and they were responsible for bringing them, towing them all the way to Chicago.
So as you get closer to the navigable part of the Grand River, you start to run into bayous because the elevation is starting to get low enough that the water kind of stays instead of drains. And right over there is one of the first ones. It's called Rip's Bayou. So it's 1822. Madame LaFramboise sells out to Rex Robinson, who runs the trading until Michigan becomes a state. And he runs the trading post, and then he decides to sell out. But before he does, he establishes a trading post at the mouth of the Grand River on Lake Michigan. And he plats out the haven on the Grand, or what we call today, Grand Haven. So also in 1837, as Poppins mentioned, riverboats began to ply the waters of the Grand River and would for the next 60 years. And at the same time, sawmills started popping up, logs started floating down the river, Grand Rapids started making furniture, and the logging era arrived at the Grand River. In each one of the landings that Poppins has been talking about, they were hauling logs down to those rivers, and in fact, they started using horse-drawn railroads to bring those logs to the landing. Blendon Landing actually had the first steam locomotive that was used to haul logs in North America, or so it's claimed. So all of those railroads that were used to haul logs, whether it was horse-drawn or steam, was considered one of the most important logging technological advances in North America in the 19th century. That's pretty impressive. And then the Michigan and Illinois Canal opened from Chicago on Lake Michigan all the way to the Mississippi River, opening up the Prairie and the Plains as a market for the timber and the lumber that was cut here in the Grand River Valley. And at that point, the Grand River became very busy. And then in 1880, at the water wheel of the Wolverine Chair Factory, they connected a dynamo to the water wheel, and they lit up a theater light and a storefront. And it was the first use of commercial hydropower in the world. But then in the spring of 1883, it rained a lot. The river rose a couple feet. Logs broke loose from booms in Lowell, Michigan, and headed downriver to Grand Rapids. They tore out 3 railroad bridges and damaged the other bridges in Grand Rapids, and then headed down this river, damaging things as it went. And if those logs escaped out into Lake Michigan, it would be a huge financial loss for all the sawmills and the furniture makers in Grand Rapids. Luckily, they got some extra pilings in for the log booms in Grand Haven, and those booms held. So that bridge right there in the Grand River marks Eastmanville, Michigan, which originally was called Scranton, but named after one of the early settlers, Mr. Eastmanville, I guess?
Mr. Eastman?
No, Mr. Eastman. The Ville is what, yeah, good.
He just,
Good, yeah. So when you get about halfway from Grand Rapids to Grand Haven, you run into the Bass River Recreation Area, where a lake's been created. It used to be a gravel pit over there. That's all excavated gravel. And they've turned it into a state recreation area, and they're working on rehabilitation of the habitat. But also in this area, as we go further, it becomes just over there, the navigable part of the river, where the Army Corps of Engineers decides to dredge part of the river and creates a channel about 5 feet deep to Lake Michigan from here. So here you start to run into more bayous. You get this large lake at Bass River called Max's Lake, and this is Max's Bayou. Hey Poppins, did you bring any snacks?
Most people bring a tackle box, Chuck, when they come to the river, but I brought a snackle box.
Whoa, God, check this out. Poppins, you're amazing.
Thanks.
I figured that way you can have a pack and sit
Not
with.
that I'm greedy or anything. A little windy and rough right now, the last 7 miles or so. So then for the next 100 years, the Grand River became a bit of a sewer where the cities would dump their oil, the logging industry dumped their waste. If you look at some of the oldest building facades in Grand Rapids, you'll notice that they don't have windows facing the river. Or they didn't have windows. They might have been added later. And then eventually cities, as they developed municipal waste management, they would dump their raw sewage right into the river during heavy rains or when there was an overflow. But today, they don't dump much in there. In fact, over 99.5% of their sewage is treated and isn't dumped into the rivers. So it's been quite a recovery on the Grand River since about the 70s, and they've really done a good job of cleaning it up and kind of restoring it to a much better place. So as we go through Grand Haven, we run into the Coast Guard, we run into the drawbridge, the swinging railroad bridge, industry, the Grand Valley State University research boat, I believe. And we're almost to Harbor Island where we take out. Thanks for joining us on the Grand River. I'm Chuck.
I'm Poppin.
The channel's Restless Viking. We'll see you later.